In this presentation, we discuss the distribution of the Balinese anaphor awakne, and I should note that Balinese has at least a few dozen anaphors because Austronesian languages, it's common for them to have registers, and awakne in particular is the low register complex reflexive. But before we talk about awakne, we first need to briefly summarize the Balinese voice alternation, which I'm sure most of you know about already. The basic idea is that Balinese transitive verbs can appear in two voices, agentive and objective. In agentive voice, the external argument, the agent, is a matrix subject. In objective voice, the internal argument is the matrix subject. And here are two examples. Ia ngatap biu, meaning she cut a banana in agentive voice, and biu gatap ia in objective voice. Agentive voice is marked with a nasal prefix on the verb, whereas the OV verb is unmarked. And I apologize in advance for my horrible Balinese pronunciation skills. A co-argument reflexive must appear post-verbally in AV, but pre-verbally in OV. Now we're looking at the distribution of awakne. We find that the reflexive must appear after the verb in AV, but before the verb in OV. So ia ngatap awakne is fine, and then that's just like English. So agentive voice is just like English, where the reflexive is the object. But with the objective voice, we see the opposite pattern. The reflexive must be the matrix subject. And that's seen in awakne gatap ia, and in GB minimalism, this binding paradigm suggests that spec TP, which we take in this talk to be the landing site of subjects in Balinese, although nothing hinges on this. We might take spec TP based on this to be an A bar position in Balinese, because it looks like movement to spec TP doesn't create an antecedent for binding. But in raising constructions, we see evidence that movement to spec TP may actually create an antecedent for binding. That's seen in 7, Ayu nenah sig awakne jedek sajan, which means Ayu seemed to herself to be very ugly, where it appears that the matrix subject is binding the reflexive in the experiencer position. Wexler 1999 suggests that this binding pattern is problematic to GB minimalist theories of binding, dubbing the apparent paradox the Balinese bind. But in positing this paradox, we believe that Wexler overlooks a crucial detail about Balinese reflexives, and this will be the topic for this talk. To be more specific, Udayana's important work on Balinese shows that Balinese complex reflexives, like many other languages of the world cross-linguistically, like Turkish, can be used logophorically to refer to a person whose speech or thoughts or feelings are being reported. That's seen in an example like the one in 8, which I fortunately will not be reading. So we argue that reflexives in raising sentences are in fact logophoric and not bound by the raised subject, which might seem counterintuitive. But we will build upon Udayana's empirical observations that awakne has logophoric properties together with a GB minimalist analysis. Here are our goals. We provide new evidence that awakne is necessarily logophoric in raising constructions. Second, we argue that the anaphor is not bound by the matrix subject, but rather by a null logophoric pronoun lower in the tree, lower than spec TP at least. Finally, we compare and contrast our solution to the Balinese bind with that of Levin 2014's, who provides another solution within the minimalist framework. Contrasting with English, in Balinese, reflexive experiencers of nenah, meaning seem, can also be anteceded by non-local perspectival centers. This is seen in a sentence like the one below. Nyoman thinks Ayu seems to himself or herself to be very ugly. In Balinese, the reflexive can refer to either Nyoman or Ayu, so awakne can refer to either of the subjects, regardless of the distance. But in English, you might notice that the only reflexive that's possible is herself. It can, in other words, it can only refer to Ayu. It can't be himself because it just can't refer to Nyoman in English because this is not a logophoric position. At least it seems to not be a logophoric position in English, but it is in Balinese, and that's the difference we'll be getting at in this talk. We argue that the reflexive in this position is always logophorically licensed, and we show this by using two diagnostics from Shannon 2020 for antecedents by an attitude holder. First, the reflexive must be obligatorily read de se, and second, an evaluative expression can be oriented to the antecedent of a reflexive. We'll see examples of these in both English and Balinese now. So exempt anaphors are anaphors that seem to violate condition A, and exempt anaphors have to be read de se. That is, the antecedent must identify the referent of the reflexive as herself. She can't just accidentally end up referring to herself. And here's an example from Charnevel and Zlogar 2015 illustrating this. So John is looking at a research article that he co-wrote with Anne many years ago, but does not recognize it as one of his own papers. Instead, he falsely assumes that Anne's co-author is a colleague of his who happens to have the same name as him. And paired with this context, a sentence like, according to John, the article was written by Anne and himself, it's not very felicitous. Furthermore, when we extend this test in the de se test in English to Balinese, we see something similar. Namely, unlike in cases of overt local binding that we just saw at the start of the talk with awakne, in these constructions, in the raising construction, awakne has to be read de se. So here's the context. Ayu is very drunk at a weekend party at her friend's house. She sees a portrait of herself that her friend has hanging up and calls the woman in the portrait ugly, though she does not realize that she is the woman in the photo. And the raising construction, Ayu nena sig awakne jedek sajan, is not felicitous when paired with this context. And if you're interested in more details on this test, I refer you to appendix slide 2. Now, so we're moving on to the second test now. That was the first test. The second test for logophoricity is possible evaluation by the antecedent. So in the sentence below, instead of putting an exempt anaphor in there, we can put an evaluative expression like a great author in the sentence below. So according to John, the article was written by Anne and a great author. The author may be great in either the eyes of the speaker or the attitude holder, John. Going back to Balinese, replacing the reflexive with an evaluative expression, we find that the expression can be evaluated from Ayu's perspective and not just the speaker's, indicating the presence of a logophoric environment. So here's the context. Ayu thinks that some person is well behaved, but you think that same person is not well behaved. Ayu is upset because that person doesn't like her appearance. The question is, why is Ayu upset? And the sentence in English, fortunately, is Ayu seems to a well-behaved person to be very ugly, but I think that person is not well-behaved. So the fact that the expression can be evaluated from Ayu's perspective rather than the speaker's indicates that this is a logophoric, that this really is a logophoric environment. And notice the contrast with English, with the raising construction in English that we have compared to Balinese. In English, this seems to be quite bad from what I can tell. So we thus far have two pieces of evidence, obligatory de se interpretation and possible evaluation by antecedents, that awakne in this position is necessarily logophoric. And this makes one crucial prediction that I'd like you guys to keep your mind on for a few minutes. So no raising ought to be needed for a reflexive experience in raising constructions, like the one I've been repeating over and over again. So ayu nena sigawakne jelek sajan. You just have no raising at all, and you could still bind the anaphor. And in fact, this prediction is borne out. So take a context like Arta took a photo of Ayu and Yoman. Ayu doesn't like the way she looks in the photo, so she hid the photo in a closet. The question is, why did Ayu hide the photo? The sentence, Nena sig awakne iya jelek sajan. So the third person embedded subject appears to be binding the anaphor. And we could, raising could have been possible, and it would have appeared as if it was binding the anaphor, but it's not necessary. And this seems to be strong evidence that, in fact, it's not the matrix subject that's binding the reflexive. So how do we account for all this? Here is the analysis that we have taken for granted in our solution of the Balinese bind. So we adopt a phase-based formulation of condition A, motivated in Shannon Bryant 2016. So according to this conception of condition A, an anaphor must be bound in the minimal spell-out domain containing it. So we adopt Shannon 2020's framework, according to which logophorically licensed anaphors are in fact always locally bound in accordance with minimalist condition A. In fact, this says that exempt anaphors don't really exist. All anaphors obey condition A. But exempt anaphors are bound by a covert logophoric pronoun, prolog, which is introduced into the syntax as a specifier of a logophoric operator. So this is schematized in 17. Crucially, log P is in fact the spell-out domain, and the projection log is inserted on the top, at the top of the spell-out domain. So for example, if you have a phase like little VP, and the spell-out domain of that is big VP, the projection that you would insert log P on top of big VP and under little VP, okay? So here's our account of binding in the Balinese voice alternation. And what's going on here in this tree is that both the agentive voice and the objective voice initially have the same structure at the start of a derivation. The agent starts off as C commanding the theme, whether or not you're dealing with the agentive voice or the objective voice. It is in this position in which binding takes place before any kind of movement that leads to the word orders in agentive voice or objective voice happens. And this is our, here is our analysis for raising constructions in which the reflexive is not bound by the matrix subject IU, rather it's bound by the null logophoric pronoun located on top of the spell-out domain of little vp. So what's going on here is that we've inserted a logophoric projection on top of the spell-out domain big VP, and the null logophoric pronoun is able to bind the reflexive in the experiencer position as such. No raising is necessary for binding to take place, okay? So we've chosen to go with the relevant binding domain as the spell-out domain of little vp, but it didn't have to be this way. So we could have potentially gone with the spell-out domain of p, because as you can see, there is a pp here that contains the reflexive. But it's not clear whether p is a phase head. I refer you to Barbara Shitko's book for further discussion. But by positing that binding occurs within little vp, we simply sidestep the problem of whether spec TP is an A or A bar position in Balinese. This is something we remain agnostic on, and I'm afraid we won't be able to solve this problem in this talk, which might be a little disappointing, unfortunately. Okay, so Levin 2014 offers a solution to the Balinese bind that incorporates Rurik and Van den Wingard's agree-based binding mechanism. There are multiple agree-based theories of anaphora out there in the literature, but this is the one that has been used to offer a solution for the Balinese bind. But Levin argues for the same conclusion that we do. Binding uniformly occurs in little vp prior to subject promotion, and there is no such thing as a Balinese binding paradox. So So here's how his account works. In particular, here's Levin's approach to the Balinese voice alternation. What you can see in this tree is that the reflexive is originally unspecified for 5 features. So right here, it's moved up, and it's moved up because it needs to specify, it needs to value its 5 features. And furthermore, the operation agree, which they assume to be downwards, needs to happen from a C commanding position under this account. So it moves to a position C commanding its binder and values its 5 features. And to get the correct result, so this is the story and the basic Balinese voice alternation, but extending this to raising constructions to get the correct result, Levin would need to assume something similar, so like covert movement from to spec little vp instead. That's his story of the of how he solves the Balinese bind paradox. So he says that the binding takes place lower in the tree in little vp, but his mechanism is different from ours. And this makes a different prediction, as we'll see. So we think there are 2 main problems for this approach. First of all, Levin 2014 doesn't note the logophoric properties first noted by Udayana and further developed by us. And furthermore, it is impossible for agree-based theories to derive the acceptability of binding in constructions without raising. So this was a sentence that I suggested you guys keep in mind. So nena sig awakne iya jelek sajan. Recall that the reflexive can be bound by something in the raising construction, even if, well, so-called raising construction, even if there is no raising at all. So recall this context sentence pair. The embedded clause appears to be finite because although Balinese doesn't have overt tensor agreement, what we do see is that there is subject licensing inside the embedded clause. Therefore, the operation agree should not be able to agree, no pun intended, with the embedded subject. And although this isn't mentioned in the slides, Levin assumes a very strong account of the phase impenetrability condition, which further rules out the possibility of binding across a finite clause boundary. So there doesn't seem to be any way he can get the acceptability of the sentence. Moving on, before concluding, we'd like to note that Balinese contradicts a long-standing generalization that has been made for decades in literature. So many linguists, going back to, I think the first was Falt's 1985, and Pika 1987 took an even stronger position than Falt's did. Anyways, many linguists have noted that the long distance property of anaphor seems to be related to the complexity of its morphology. So for example, they've said things like long distance anaphors tend to be monomorphemic. I think that's what Falt said, and Pika said they have to be monomorphemic, something like that. Well, that's contradicted by anaphors like himself or herself in English. So Haspelmouth 2008, he provides the most generous possible interpretation of this universal that isn't, of this so-called universal that isn't contradicted by anaphors like herself in English. So what he says is this: if a language has different reflexive pronouns in local and long distance contexts, the local reflexive pronoun is at least as complex phonologically as the long distance one. And what's interesting is that Balinese flat out contradicts this generalization in the field. Awakne, which we haven't mentioned till now, is actually a complex reflexive. It's made up of the word for, awak is I think a low register word for body, whereas the suffix ne is a third person possessive marker, and awakne ends up being a complex reflexive. Balinese also has a simplex reflexive awak, the word meaning body, but this simplex reflexive can never be read long distance. So in a sentence like, Nyoman thinks Ayu kicked herself, if we have awak instead of awakne in the sentence, awak can only refer to Ayu, can't refer to Nyoman. Whereas if we have awakne instead of awak here, it can refer to either Nyoman or Ayu. And as I said, Balinese contradicts this generalization in the field. To conclude, we've argued that Wexler 1999's paradox for GB minimalist theories of binding doesn't exist by providing novel empirical evidence that awakne is necessarily logophorically bound in raising constructions, thus obviating the need to assign variable status to spec TP. And we'd like to thank you for listening.
All right, thank you. We have around 10 minutes for questions. Okay, we have a question from Edith. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, I hope you guys can all hear me. Thank you for the talk. It was very clear and very interesting. I just have one really simple question, and that is, have you looked at, person interactions? So another thing that has been cited in the literature on long distance binding and logophore binding in general is that so if you have, I think you showed an example before where so-and-so thinks that so-and-so likes him or herself, and the reflexive can be construed with either the embedded or the matrix subject. But if in the embedded clause you stick in a first or second person subject, then the long distance binding is nullified. And I'm just curious if you've looked at that condition at all.
Yeah, so we have, and it appears that, so in English, it's rather, it's more simple because anaphors like myself and yourself, so you can say something like linguists like myself, it's very easily licensed in English. Whereas in Balinese, we have looked into this, it seems like it's not so easily licensed. So our main native speaker consultant very easily licensed the, so he treated, so his dialect of Balinese was like basically like English. He would just license, as far as I recall, the first person anaphor like anywhere, just like English. But so we were in touch with Udayana and other speakers of Balinese, and in their dialect, they didn't really, so for them, like going back to this construction, they didn't really license the first person anaphor here at all, which is surprising because one of Charnevel's most important observation is that you can always license a first person anaphor in a logophore context. So yes, that the fact that there's this cross-linguistic, variation across dialects is puzzling to us, that that you can't license a first-person anaphor here in some dialects, but you can in others. But yeah, but I think that's not necessarily problematic. I hope I've been able to answer your question.
It actually was a different question. I'm going to do a follow-up in the chat that you might be interested in.
Cool.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We have a question from Dan Rudkin.
Thanks, guys. Really interesting talk. So I have a question about the distribution of logophores. So Balinese, the patient voice external argument cannot be an anaphor, right? Like you can't say something like, I was seen awakku, or I was seen by myself, right?
I believe so.
Why?
I
mean, couldn't the logophore be licensed there? If the log P can...
Yeah, so the patient voice, I think my co-author might know this better than I do, but as far as I can recall, there's something really weird going on with the patient voice. I think it's I can't remember exactly what was going on, but the patient voice or something, well, it would only be licensed in like metaphorical context or something like that, but usually it's not licensed. But I'd have to double check and follow up with you on that. So that, I think the answer for that is definitely in Udayana's dissertation if you want to look at that. So awak isn't, well, first of all, awak isn't never logophoric. Only the complex reflexive is. So if you, yeah, so if you say awak, that necessarily precludes the logophoric interpretation. and feel free
Right.
to follow up if you.
Right. I mean, so it's an observation of Bill Davies that these things like dirinya or diriku in Indonesian, or the equivalents in Japanese, can never be, even though they're not really subject to condition A, and they look like logophores, can never be patient voice external arguments. And it seems like an interesting question on a theory that governs the distribution of exempt anaphors. Like, why should that?
Yeah, you should take a look at Udayana's dissertation. I think he has some very specific data on that. Yeah, that could answer your question, although I can't recall it from the top of my head. Anyone else?
We still have around 4 minutes.
Oh, so interference from potential antecedents. We did look into that. And so does Mandarin behave like Balinese? We definitely looked into that, and I believe that it doesn't, as far as I can recall, although I'd have to double check that. We do have that sentence somewhere though, I think.
Yeah, I would be curious to see that data. That would be
It
really
might be,
interesting.
yeah, it might be in our manuscript. I'll take a look, and after this talk, I might just send it to you if it does.
Awesome. Thanks.
No problem.